They called it a safe town, a peaceful college community tucked among Idaho's rolling hills. But one November morning, the silence broke, and 4 young lives simply disappeared into the shadows. No witnesses, no screams, only questions that refused to die. Was it a calculated act of darkness, or something far stranger, something unseen that walks among us when we're most at peace? Because sometimes evil doesn't knock. It waits. Tonight, we journey beyond the evidence, through theories, fear, and the strange coincidences that turned one small town into the center of America's most chilling mystery. So before we step into the fog, tap subscribe, like, and share this story, not just to support, but to help us keep uncovering the mysteries that refuse to rest. Welcome to Mystery Vault 80, where truth fades and mystery begins. The quiet town before the storm. Idaho, a land of mountains, pines, and peaceful college towns. A place where doors were rarely locked, and nights were quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. Nestled among these rolling hills was Moscow, Idaho, a small, vibrant community built around the University of Idaho. For years, it had been the kind of town where tragedy seemed unthinkable. But all that changed on one cold November night, the night 4 promising college students vanished into silence. Before the headlines, before the chaos, there was only ordinary life. Laughter echoing down Greek Row. Late-night study sessions. Weekend gatherings that spilled from kitchen to porch. Among those living that dream was Kaylee Goncalves, confident and ambitious, about to graduate and move into a new life. Madison Mogan, her best friend, inseparable since childhood. Xana Kernadle, full of energy, balancing school and work. And Ethan Chapin, the easygoing athlete, deeply in love. They were the picture of youth, friendship, and future until everything changed. That night, the 4 returned to their shared off-campus house after a normal Saturday evening. The lights flickered off. The small town slept. And within hours, the calm of Moscow, Idaho, shattered forever. By morning, nothing in Moscow would ever be the same again. The morning of discovery. It was a Sunday morning in Moscow, Idaho. The sun rose slowly over the Palouse Hills, painting golden light across a quiet neighborhood. But inside one modest house near the university campus, that peace had already been broken. Friends and roommates had been trying to reach the 4 students, Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, since the early hours. Texts went unread. Calls went unanswered. At first, it was easy to brush off. College students sleep late. But as the hours ticked by, unease began to set in. Around late morning, 2 other roommates, who had been in the home that night, began noticing something strange. The house was too still. Doors were locked. No sounds of movement or conversation. Then came a moment no one could ever prepare for. They called friends over, believing someone had simply overslept. But when one of them opened a bedroom door, everything changed. Inside, they discovered a scene that would haunt Moscow forever. For their friends gone. No sign of struggle heard during the night. No sounds of breaking glass or forced entry. Just silence and horror. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call came from one of the surviving roommates' phones. The report, an unconscious person. But when officers arrived, what they found was far worse. A violent crime scene that defied explanation. The 4 students had been brutally murdered. Nothing was stolen. The front door was locked. And neighbors reported nothing unusual. Not a scream, not a crash, not even a raised voice. How could such a thing happen in a house filled with people, without anyone hearing? By that afternoon, the Moscow Police Department declared what would become one of the most shocking investigations in recent American history. Yellow tape sealed off the home. Reporters flooded into town. Families received the calls that no parent should ever hear. And a mystery began to unfold that would grip the nation, not only for its brutality, but for its silence. For the next few days, the world would search for answers, but Moscow, Idaho, would only find confusion, fear, and an unsettling truth. Sometimes, evil doesn't make a sound. The investigation begins. Within hours of the 911 call, Moscow transformed from a peaceful college town into the epicenter of a nightmare. Dozens of police vehicles lined King Road. Yellow tape fluttered in the cold November wind. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, trying to understand what could have happened inside the quiet rental home at 1122 King Road. For investigators, the scene was unlike anything they had ever seen. For young lives, ended violently, yet with almost surgical precision. No forced entry, no broken glass, no clear motive. The first question echoed through the air. Was this a targeted attack or a random act of pure evil? Detectives and forensic teams worked through the night, carefully photographing, collecting DNA, and trying to reconstruct the final moments of the victims' lives. In the early hours, local authorities urged calm. They assured the public there was no ongoing threat. But that statement, soon retracted, would ignite a storm. 4 University of Idaho students found dead in off-campus home. Police say there's no suspect in custody. The community is on edge tonight. Confusion spread faster than facts. Within 24 hours, national media descended upon the town. Cameras pointed at the small, White House now guarded by uniformed officers. Rumors began to swirl about the surviving roommates, about strangers seen in the area, about a mysterious vehicle captured on camera near the crime scene. As social media picked apart every new detail, the line between truth and speculation blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, detectives interviewed classmates, friends, and even ex-boyfriends. But the picture grew only more tangled. Every lead seemed to end in a dead end. Every rumor only deepened the sense of fear. Moscow, a town once known for its quiet charm, was now living under a shadow of paranoia. Forensic teams worked tirelessly. Blood evidence, DNA traces, security footage, all under review. But without a suspect, even the sharpest clues seemed to dissolve into the noise. People locked their doors for the first time. Students left campus. Parents drove hundreds of miles to take their children home. In a place where nothing bad ever happened, fear had finally arrived. And as investigators scoured through hours of security footage, they caught a glimpse of something. A white Hyundai Elantra passing by the King Roadhouse in the dead of night. A lead, a clue, or just another coincidence. The search had officially begun, and with it, the long, uncertain road to uncovering the truth behind the night they vanished. Each scene in this chapter is designed for 10 to 12 minutes of runtime, balancing investigative depth and haunting mystery. The suspect in the shadows. Weeks turned into months. The leaves fell from the trees, and snow began to blanket Moscow. Yet, despite hundreds of tips and countless interviews, the case seemed frozen, just like the Idaho winter itself. But somewhere inside the storm of evidence, a quiet pattern was forming. Detectives from the Moscow Police Department, working alongside the FBI and Idaho State Police, were piecing together digital breadcrumbs, fragments of movement, cellular data, and surveillance footage. And one particular piece of that puzzle kept returning to their attention. A white Hyundai Elantra, seen circling the neighborhood multiple times on the night of the murders. It wasn't just once. It wasn't by accident. That car had been in the area repeatedly, minutes before and after the estimated time of the killings. Whoever was behind that might hold the key to everything. By late December, law enforcement traced the car to a graduate student living across state lines, in Pullman, Washington, just 10 miles from Moscow. His name would soon become synonymous with the case. Brian Christopher Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student studying criminology, a man who, on paper, understood the psychology of murder. A quiet, intelligent academic with an unsettling interest in criminal behavior. He had studied serial killers, stalkers, and the mindset of those who commit violent acts. He had even posted online, asking criminals to describe their emotions during the moment of a crime. It was eerie. It was almost as if he'd been preparing for something. As agents began monitoring Kohberger, they noticed odd details. He'd cleaned his car meticulously, inside and out. His cell phone had been turned off for hours during the time of the murders. And yet, It had pinged in the same area on 12 separate occasions before that fatal night. 12 visits to the same quiet street before the victims were killed. Coincidence or premeditation? Investigators moved carefully. They didn't want to spook him. They followed him from campus to his apartment, from class to grocery stores, and eventually across the country. When Brian Kohberger and his father embarked on a cross-country drive home to Pennsylvania for the holidays, FBI surveillance teams were close behind. They tracked every mile, waiting for the perfect moment to move. On December 30th, 2022, before dawn, a SWAT team surrounded a quiet home in the Pocono Mountains. Moments later, they entered and found Kohberger inside. He was calm, almost detached, and when they searched his belongings, the evidence began to speak. A DNA sample found on the knife sheath left at the crime scene matched his genetic profile. Cell phone data placed him near the victim's home. And the white Hyundai? It was his. Every thread was starting to tighten. But even with this mountain of evidence, questions still echoed. Why them? What drove a criminology student, someone trained to understand crime, to allegedly commit one so brutal? And what did he do in the weeks before his arrest? The suspect was now behind bars. But for the victims' families, and for an entire nation still gripped by shock, the answers remained agonizingly incomplete. Because every time investigators looked closer, the story grew darker, and the motives more twisted. In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into the mind of the accused. What led him to this path? And what secrets still linger between the evidence, the silence, and the shadows of Idaho? Inside the mind, the psychology of the killer. To understand the horror of what happened in Moscow, Idaho, investigators had to go beyond bloodstains and DNA. They had to look inside the mind of the man accused, Brian Christopher Kohberger. What they found was not a monster born overnight, but a mind shaped over years by obsession, isolation, and control. Before the world knew his name, Brian was a quiet figure on the Washington State University campus, tall, pale, serious. A PhD student in criminology, he spoke in measured tones, often more interested in theory than people. Classmates described him as intense. Professors saw potential. But underneath, something else was growing, a fascination with the darkness he studied. Online, investigators discovered an unsettling pattern. Months before the killings, Kohberger had posted research surveys asking convicted criminals how they felt before, during, and after committing a violent act. The questions were chillingly direct. What did you think and feel during your crime? How did you plan your attack? What emotions drove your choice of victim? To most, it was just academic curiosity. But in hindsight, it read like a psychological rehearsal. He'd been studying the methods of killers, their patterns, their mistakes, their precision. And yet, when compared to the evidence in Moscow, it seemed almost scripted. The careful approach, the absence of theft, the single, sharp weapon used with purpose. Each detail hinted at a mind that wanted control, not chaos. Then came his movements. Data showed that he had driven by the victim's house at least a dozen times before the attack. He turned off his phone hours before the murders, a deliberate choice to vanish from the digital grid. And when it was over, he drove hundreds of miles, cleaned his car, and returned to class as if nothing had happened. No confession, no remorse, just silence. Psychologists who studied the case began to form theories. Some believed Kohberger's alleged actions were driven by power, the desire to prove superiority. Others saw it as an act of intellectual ego, a criminologist trying to commit the perfect crime. But maybe it wasn't about perfection. Maybe it was about control, the one thing he couldn't achieve in his ordinary life. Those who knew him noticed changes months before the tragedy. Weight loss, agitation, late-night drives with no explanation. He had distanced himself from friends and family, retreating further into isolation and into his own head. And when someone like that finally breaks, the result is rarely rational. During interviews after his arrest, Kohberger showed little emotion. No visible panic, no breakdown, just a cold awareness, as if he was observing his own case unfold like one of his studies. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. a criminology student, now the subject of one of America's most analyzed murder cases. But for all the psychological theories and expert profiles, one haunting truth remains. No one can ever fully explain why someone crosses that invisible line. From studying crime to committing one, the victims had dreams. They had laughter, friends, and a future that should have stretched far beyond that November night. Instead, the story now belongs to courtrooms, case files, and the cold archives of true crime. But the story isn't over. In the next chapter, we follow the trial and the nation's demand for justice. Will the evidence hold? Or will the shadows of Idaho keep their secrets forever? The trial begins, justice or doubt. After weeks of speculation and months of silent investigation, the world finally saw the man at the center of the Idaho mystery, Brian Christopher Kohberger. On January 3rd, 2023, in a quiet courthouse in Pennsylvania, he appeared for extradition. Shackled, calm, emotionless, he waived his right to fight the transfer. He was coming back to Idaho to face the charges of 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. As cameras captured his every move, the world asked a single, haunting question. Did he do it? Or had investigators followed a trail of coincidences that only looked like guilt? The courtroom became the nation's stage. Families of the victims filled the seats, their faces marked by grief and quiet strength. Reporters lined the aisles, and behind it all, the air carried a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Because for every piece of evidence the prosecution presented, the defense countered with silence and doubt. The case against Kohberger was built on 3 pillars. DNA evidence. The knife sheath found near one victim matched his genetic profile. Surveillance footage, showing his white Hyundai Elantra near the scene. Cell phone data, placing him in the area before and after the killings. But as defense attorneys pointed out, there was no murder weapon recovered, and no direct witness linking him to the act. The prosecution painted him as a calculated killer, a man who stalked his victims, planned his moves, and executed his crime with precision. But the defense suggested something else, that the evidence was circumstantial, that DNA could have been transferred, that the case, in their words, was built on assumptions, not certainty. In the heart of this legal battle stood the families, waiting, watching, hoping for answers that might never come. Every court session reopened the wounds of that November night. Every headline reminded them of what was taken, for young lives stolen without reason. And yet, beneath the legal language and courtroom strategy, another mystery deepened: the motive. Why had this happened? Was it rage? Obsession? A twisted intellectual challenge gone too far? The prosecution hinted at a possible fixation, that Kohberger may have known one or more of the victims. The defense denied it completely. Weeks turned into months. Hearing after hearing delayed the trial. Each new filing brought more questions. Each silence, more frustration. Outside the courtroom, the world was divided, some demanding swift justice, others urging caution. Social media became a war zone of theories, claims, and misinformation. Everyone wanted closure, but the truth was still locked away, somewhere between evidence and emotion. For the victims' families, justice is not about headlines or hashtags. It's about answers. And even as the legal process continues, those answers remain just beyond reach. Because justice in this case moves slowly. And in the silence of waiting, the shadows of Idaho grow darker. Echoes in Moscow, a town haunted by silence. Before the headlines, before the police tape, Moscow, Idaho was a postcard town, small, safe, and steady. A college city where strangers smiled at each other, where the loudest nights were football games or student parties. But after November 13th, 2022, everything changed. The town that once slept easy now flinched at every siren. Fear settled over the town like a shadow that refused to lift. Every creak of a door, every flicker of light felt different. Parents called their children daily, terrified to let them walk alone. Students fled home, classes went online, and the once bustling college town became ghostly quiet. At the center of it all stood the University of Idaho, a place now burdened with unthinkable loss. 4 young lives: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernadal, and Ethan Chapin, names now etched into the collective grief of the community. Posters of remembrance lined the walls. Vigils flickered with candlelight. And across campus, the phrase, "Vandal Strong," became both a cry for unity and a plea for healing. But trauma doesn't vanish with time. Even as the police presence faded, the silence lingered. Every student who returned felt it, that invisible mark left on the town. Moscow became a case study in fear. How quickly innocence can vanish when tragedy strikes so close to home. Local shop owners spoke of nights where no customers came. Campus security tripled, and for months, the sound of helicopters and news vans replaced laughter and music. The media turned Moscow into a spectacle. Satellite trucks lined the streets. National reporters chased rumors more than truth. And amid all that noise, one simple fact remained. For young lives were gone, and no amount of coverage could bring them back. Yet, even in tragedy, there was resilience. Students returned, classes resumed, and community members, side by side, rebuilt a sense of safety, one small act at a time. Neighbors began walking each other home again. Professors opened their doors to talk, and every candle still burning at the memorial reminded Moscow that healing, though slow, was possible. But beneath the recovery, new questions formed, questions that law enforcement, even now, struggle to answer. Why were these 4 chosen? What did the killers see in that house on King Road? And if Koberger is truly guilty, what turned a quiet criminology student into a calculated murderer? To this day, some residents believe the story isn't over, that there are hidden details still buried in case files or silenced by fear. For others, the official story is enough. They just want peace. They want closure. But closure is rarely what true crime offers. And in Moscow, the echoes continue. Because sometimes a town never truly goes back to normal. Sometimes the ghosts stay, not as spirits, but as memories carved into the walls of the places we once felt safe. In the next chapter, we'll go beyond the town and into the investigation's heart. How far did the digital trail go? And what secrets were uncovered from the devices and data left behind by both the victims and their killer? The digital trail, secrets hidden in data. In today's world, every move we make leaves a trace, a signal, a message, a digital shadow. And in the Idaho case, it was that invisible network of data that began to reveal the truth hiding in plain sight. Investigators knew that physical evidence alone wouldn't tell the full story. To solve this crime, they would have to follow the digital fingerprints left behind: texts, calls, GPS data, surveillance footage, and more. When detectives retrieved the victims' phones, they found ordinary lives frozen in time. Selfies, messages, plans for the next day. Nothing unusual, except the abrupt silence after 4 a.m. The phones went dark. The lives behind them stopped. From there, the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit began reconstructing movements, not just of the victims, but of Brian Koberger himself. His phone, according to tower records, had traveled the same route from Pullman to Moscow several times in the weeks before the murders. He had been there, watching, tracking the same area, almost rehearsing. On the night of the crime, his phone suddenly went silent between 2:47 and 4 a.m. A digital blackout, as if someone had deliberately erased their presence from the grid. But technology never truly forgets. Later analysis showed his device reconnected near the crime scene just minutes after the murders. A small window of reactivation, enough to place him within the area before he sped back to Washington. Meanwhile, the white Hyundai Elantra seen on surveillance footage traced the same route. Security cameras from multiple homes captured a car matching his, looping through the neighborhood again and again. To investigators, this wasn't randomness. It was ritual, a loop of intent. The most disturbing findings came from the suspect's online activity. Late-night searches on criminal psychology. forums discussing staying unseen, discussions about how investigators find killers and how to avoid detection. These weren't just academic curiosities. They were windows into preparation. What investigators saw in that data wasn't just evidence. It was premeditation, the deliberate planning of a mind that believed it could outthink the system. But the digital trail didn't end there. Forensic teams discovered Kohberger's social media patterns, silent likes, quiet follows, and interactions with accounts linked to one of the victims. It wasn't proof of direct contact, but it was enough to suggest awareness. He knew them. He had seen their lives online. Investigators also recovered GPS data from his car and computer metadata that matched searches for the victims' addresses. One chilling record stood out. A Google Maps search for Moscow, Idaho police reports days after the killings. He wasn't just watching the town. He was watching the investigation. This digital web, the phones, the cameras, the search history, it all came together to form the skeleton of the prosecution's case. Each ping, each click, a line connecting killer to crime. And yet, amid all this data, one haunting truth remains. For all the technology, all the tracking, we still may never know why. Because the digital world can expose actions, but it can't always expose motive. Only the human heart holds that. And sometimes it stays locked forever. In the next chapter, the trial draws closer and the nation waits. But as new evidence surfaces, the question begins to shift. Is the case really as airtight as it seems? Or are there still cracks in the foundation of justice? Cracks in the case, truth or misstep? By now, the nation was convinced the police had their man. The evidence, DNA, digital data, and surveillance seemed unshakable. But as the case moved closer to trial, tiny cracks began to appear, cracks that made some wonder if the truth might be more complicated than it seemed. Every case, no matter how strong, carries its flaws. Forensic timelines can blur, human error can creep in, and assumptions can shift an investigation off course. And when defense attorneys began examining the details behind the Idaho murders, they found questions, the kind that could change everything. First, there was the DNA evidence. A single sheath from a military-style knife found at the scene contained a male DNA profile. Investigators matched it to Brian Kohberger's father through genealogical tracing. But critics asked, how reliable was this process? Could the sample have been contaminated, or was it circumstantial? The defense argued that the prosecution's reliance on partial genealogy was shaky at best. They claimed that without a direct DNA sample from Kohberger found at the crime scene itself, there was room for doubt. Then came the cell tower data, the supposed digital proof that tied him to the victim's neighborhood. Defense experts argued that tower pings can sometimes reach across miles, misplacing locations by large distances. They questioned whether the signal that placed Kohberger near the crime scene was truly conclusive, or simply coincidental. The surveillance footage of the white Hyundai Elantra raised its own questions. Yes, cameras had recorded a car matching the description, but there was no clear license plate captured, no undeniable proof that it was his car. To the defense, that gap meant everything. A white Elantra, they argued, was not unique. There were thousands of identical models across Idaho and Washington. Perhaps the most haunting question surrounded the timeline itself. Could one person truly have committed the murders, escaped unseen, and driven home within the narrow time window established by police? Some experts doubted it. Others believed only an obsessive precision or prior planning could explain it. Outside the courtroom, the case ignited a storm of speculation. Online forums dissected every police statement, every photograph, every inconsistency. Conspiracy theories emerged. Alternate suspects, cover-up claims, and whispers that the investigation had moved too fast. For the families of the victims, this was agony all over again. Each rumor reopening wounds, each delay extending their grief. Still, investigators stood firm. The evidence, they said, was solid. The suspect's behavior before and after the murders told a story of obsession, preparation, and cold calculation. But behind closed doors, Even seasoned detectives wondered, had they truly uncovered every layer? Or was there someone they had missed? In the American justice system, doubt is both a weapon and a shield. For some, it's a tool to seek truth. For others, it's a way to escape it. And as the case neared trial, doubt was the only thing that seemed to grow louder than the evidence itself. Next, as the courtroom opens, prosecutors lay out the story they believe proves everything. But when the defense fires back, the world realizes that truth and perception don't always walk hand in hand. The trial of shadows, justice or judgment. After months of speculation, delays, and public fury, the Idaho case finally entered the courtroom. What had begun as a nightmare in a small college town was now the most anticipated trial in America. The question that echoed through every hallway was simple. Was Bryan Kohberger truly the killer? Or had investigators, under immense pressure, followed the trail of the wrong man? On one side stood the prosecution, armed with science, data, and motive. On the other, the defense, ready to dismantle every piece of that evidence, one detail at a time. The courtroom became a stage. Every moment, every pause, every witness, a piece of a puzzle that could either deliver justice or expose doubt. Prosecutors painted Kohberger as a man obsessed with control, fascinated by criminal psychology, and drawn to the idea of the perfect crime. They told the jury he had stalked his victims, studied their habits, their house, even their sleep schedules. They showed cell tower data, tracing his car's movements, surveillance footage placing a white Elantra near the victim's home, and DNA recovered from the knife sheath found beside one of the victims. Each point connected, at least on paper, to one person. To them, the story was airtight. But while evidence builds a case, doubt builds a defense. The defense strikes back. The defense came armed not with emotion, but with skepticism. They reminded the jury that there were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no direct footage of the murders. That the DNA was partial, and that genealogy tracing could be flawed. They argued that the state's story relied on assumption. That technology, no matter how advanced, can't replace absolute proof. And most powerfully, they suggested the unthinkable, that someone else could have been there. They introduced alternate theories, questioned timelines, and demanded to know why key details, like missing camera footage or delayed reports, hadn't been disclosed immediately. To the defense, this wasn't just a trial about guilt. It was about reasonable doubt, the families and the public. In the gallery, the victims' families sat, faces carved by grief and exhaustion. They had lived this tragedy every day since November 13th. Now, they were forced to relive it, minute by minute, through evidence photos and expert testimonies. Outside, the media frenzy raged on. TV trucks lined the streets. Every update became a headline. Every silence, a rumor. Social media turned the trial into a spectacle. Justice on display, streamed and judged in real time. The crossroads of truth. In the end, the courtroom became more than a place for justice. It became a reflection of a nation divided between those who saw undeniable guilt and those who saw unsettling uncertainty. The truth, it seemed, was no longer about facts alone. It was about perspective, about how much darkness people were willing to see and how much they chose to ignore. As closing arguments approached, one haunting thought lingered. If the evidence was so clear, why did so many still feel unconvinced? Next, we moved beyond the verdict and into the storm that followed. How the world reacted, what the families endured, and why, even with a suspect behind bars, the mystery refuses to die. Aftermath, a nation haunted. When the trial ended, Idaho's quiet hills fell silent again. But it wasn't the same silence that existed before November 13th. This was the heavy kind, the kind that lingers in every street corner, every college dorm, every empty house light still left burning. The town of Moscow, once defined by community and safety, had become something else, a place marked forever by loss. The family's unending grief. For the families of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan, the verdict, whatever it brought, could never fill the hole left behind. They had lost futures, milestones, and laughter that would never return. Kaylee's parents spoke of her boundless dreams. Madison's loved ones remembered her golden smile. Xana's family replayed her last messages over and over again. And Ethan's siblings tried to hold each other together, as if by doing so, they could keep. Justice, they learned, is not healing. It's only survival, a fragile bridge between truth and pain, a community forever changed. For the students who remained at the University of Idaho, campus life became a balancing act between memory and fear. Late-night study sessions stopped. Parties ended earlier, and every stranger's face felt like a question. The town began installing more lights, cameras, and locks. But no amount of security could erase the shadow of what had happened. Fear had become a quiet companion, walking beside them all. The nation watches on. Across the United States, millions continued to follow the case. Podcasts, documentaries, online forums dissecting every word. Everyone wanted to know why. Why those four? Why there? Why him? But the truth is, no explanation could satisfy that question. Some horrors don't fit into reason. Some tragedies are simply the echoes of a darkness we can't predict or control. Yet, even in the pain, the nation found something else: unity. A shared grief that crossed borders and beliefs. Candlelight vigils appeared not just in Idaho, but across the U.S. Strangers prayed together. Communities hugged tighter. It was proof that even in the deepest tragedy, humanity still responds with light. The lingering mystery. But beneath the surface, questions remained. Was justice truly done? Had all the answers been found? And why did certain pieces, small details, odd silences, timing gaps still not make sense? In every case, there's what we know and what we may never know. And in Idaho, that second list feels endless. Some believe the story is over. Others believe it's only begun, that the shadows of that night still move just beyond sight. The legacy they leave behind. What remains, above all, are the lives of four young people. Bright, kind, and full of promise. Their friends and families have since created scholarships, foundations, and outreach programs, not to erase the pain, but to make sure their light continues to guide others. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, Ethan, for names that should have had decades ahead of them. Now, they're remembered as symbols of hope in a world that sometimes forgets how fragile life can be. But even as Idaho tries to move forward, one final question lingers. Was this tragedy the result of one man's obsession, or the reflection of something deeper, something human, that lies in us all? We'll look at what this case has truly taught us about fear, justice, and the mystery of why some people vanish into darkness, while others never stop searching for light. Echoes of the vanished, lessons from the shadows. In the end, stories like these never truly end. They remain suspended between justice and memory, between truth and the unknowable darkness that surrounds it. The Idaho tragedy began as a story of horror, but what it became was a mirror, a reflection of how fragile our sense of safety really is. The weight of unanswered questions. For some, justice feels served, a suspect behind bars, a community healing piece by piece. But for others, there's a quiet ache that no verdict can ease. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? What drives a person to such darkness? And how do we stop it from happening again? These are questions without clear answers. Because when life is taken so suddenly, reason rarely follows. Truth versus mystery. Every crime story has two sides. The first, the evidence, the data, the cold facts. The second, the mystery that facts alone can never solve. The why behind the act, the void left behind. And in that space, between certainty and silence, the story of the vanished continues to echo, a reflection on humanity. The Idaho case reminded us that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it wears the face of a student, a neighbor, someone ordinary. It taught us that darkness often hides in plain sight, and that fear, when faced together, can still lead to strength. But more than anything, It reminded the world that life is painfully fragile. Those 4 lives, full of hope and laughter, can vanish in a single night and leave behind a silence that speaks louder than words ever could. The legacy lives on. Today, new students walk through the same streets, the same campus, the same town that once held so much fear. But where there was once only grief, now there is remembrance. Scholarships in their names. Candlelight vigils that still draw crowds. A promise that their light won't fade with time. Kaylee, Madison, Xana, Ethan, for names forever etched into Idaho's history. For souls that remind us to live, to love, and to never forget. Final reflection. And so, the story of the vanished forecloses here. But somewhere, in the quiet of a small Idaho town, a candle still burns in their memory. A reminder that the truth may fade, but the mystery never truly ends. The mystery of the vanished 4 lingers. A haunting reminder that light and darkness are never far apart. If you believe their story deserves to be remembered, like, share, and subscribe to at Mystery Vault 80, where we explore the unseen, the unexplained, and the stories the world can't forget.